Hello, my name is Linda Abraham, and I am the president of Accepted and the moderator of today's webinar. I want to welcome all of you to create a winning AMCAS application to be presented by Alicia McNease Nimonkar. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. If you have not downloaded and printed out the worksheet for today's presentation, I invite you to do so now. We've prepared the handout to make it easier to take notes and basically to get the most out of the webinar. Again, it's in the handout section of your dashboard. I would advise you to print it out, but if you prefer to take notes in a different way or do it on the screen, that's obviously also okay. Alicia is going to ask several questions during the presentation and ask you to raise your hand in response. You can do so by clicking on the hand icon, two icons underneath the horizontal orange arrow on your control panel. Please raise your hand when you find it. So click on that icon is what I'm saying. You guys clicking? Yeah, right. Yeah, there you go. You're clicking on the icon. Very good. Okay. Right. That's good. Number 3, raising hands allows you to respond to our questions, but what about your questions? We have time both during and at the end of Alicia's presentation for questions, and we'll answer them then. Lastly, if you have a question, a general question, and we run out of time before answering it today, you can post it on accepted.com/AMCAS questions. AMCAS questions is all one word. No space, no plural, AMCAS, QUESTIONS. Now, yeah, it's plural. And last housekeeping point. When you leave, you will receive a brief survey. Please fill it out. We value your feedback, and we use it. As a matter of fact, I gave a webinar yesterday. I'm going to be making changes to my next webinar based specifically on feedback that we got in the survey. Finally, I'm thrilled to introduce Alicia McNease Nimonkar, who will present Create a Winning AMCAS application today. Alicia started advising Accepted's clients in 2012, and she was immediately earning rave reviews from her clients and has been earning them ever since. Prior to joining Accepted, she both evaluated applications and advised med school applicants as director of the UC Davis Postbac program. She brings enormous insight and experience with the medical school application process to the webinar today. Without further ado, Alicia McNease Nimonkar, and Create a Winning AMCAS application.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So we're going to start with a poll. And the first question we have is, how many people have applied to medical school? So for those of you listening, how many of you have applied to medical school? If you can give us a show of hands.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so hands are still going up. We have about 12%. 12% have. Okay?
Nice. It's a lot of first-time applicants. That helps me to know that to customize the webinar to you. So for those of you who have applied, what sections of the AMCAS application did you have the most difficulty completing?
Okay, let me get that poll out. There we go. It should be appearing on your screen momentarily. There it is. If you could just click on the screen, the section that's you found most difficult. Okay. And actually, the first timers can also write the one that they're finding most difficult because they're completing it now also, okay? Is that all right with you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
All right. So let's so anybody can complete. Which one did you find or are you finding most difficult? The personal statement, the activity section, or the statement of disadvantage? We have 76% having voted. 5, 4, can we get it up? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll with 82% having voted. The results are that 65% found the personal statement most difficult, 27% said the activity section, and 8% said the statement of disadvantage. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. So the personal statement, I agree, can be an intimidating part of the application process, and we're going to discuss that in detail. So we're going to give you strategies for each part of the primary application today. So why an AMCAS workshop? Why is this helpful? Well, we want to help you evaluate where you are in the process. So if you determine your location, right, you can come up with a strategy. So I know it can be very stressful to be submitting your medical school application, and it may feel like getting stuck in a labyrinth, but we're here to help you self-reflect, to assess your strengths and your weaknesses, and to come up with a strategy, because you have to have a destination or you'll never reach your specific location. So we're going to help you come up with strategies for all the different sections of the primary application today. So we'll start with the most difficult section, the personal statement. So why is this section so hard?
Could you
So
provide,
for those of you listening,
can you provide an answer in the question window? Okay, Sarah says narrowing a topic is difficult. It's Stephanie, hard to evaluate myself. It's hard to talk about yourself, says Chris. Your limited characters in terms of the length of the essay. You don't know which experience to hone in on, trying to get your personality to come across, elaborating to fit the character limit. That's apparently, a couple of people mentioned that. Darren says that you need to be profound and simple at the same time. Maybe it's profound and clear. Sarah says that getting her personality across is difficult. Bringing everything I've done together to one main point is difficult, says Candace. Keeping a theme, says Patricia. There's no rubric or guideline expectation to stand out. It's hard to find something very unique to write about, says Emily. These are all true. This is all great stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Finding relevant, and I'm not even including everything, finding relevant information to relate to why you want to be a doctor without sounding like you're gloating or like everybody else.
That's a good one. Yeah. That's a really good one.
Comparing your story to others. It's difficult to incorporate many different things under one umbrella, says Nick. Feeling like your story isn't good enough, being unique, standing out. These are all really good comments. They're all reasons why the personal statement is difficult to write.
Yeah, this is true. So I would say, being profound, but also being simple. I thought that was a great comment that somebody made.
Yeah.
I think if you are honest, your personal statement can become profound if you're honest and you focus on the subtleties in your honest, realistic motivations for wanting to go into medicine. So I think it is possible to have that balance of telling your story in a way that a person could quickly read it and understand it, but also in a way that's profound and that maybe makes them pause and think, wow, this is really remarkable. Personality, you've got to be careful with that one, right? You don't want to have too much personality, but you don't want to have not enough. So that's a really good point that someone made, is you've got to have personality. The character limit, it may seem difficult to capture your entire story in a page and a half, essentially, but it is possible, right? It is possible with lots of edits, right, drafts, and taking time to really do your best. And coming up with a theme, I would say hopefully you have more than one theme, right? Most people are very complex, and usually there's a number of themes that you can draw out of your experiences. So we'll talk about ways to do that. And again, I love that somebody said there's no rubric or guidelines, no clear expectations in terms of what to have, what not to have. And it's true, I think sometimes you get more guidance from essays that you write for school than you probably do in these applications. So it's true there is no rubric, but we can talk about what expectations you should probably have for your own personal statement. Okay, so moving on, I would say some of the best personal statements have a balance, right? You don't want to be too personal, but you also don't want to be too professional. So you want to strike a balance in how much personal information you share versus how much professional information. So I think one of the best examples I have of, I wouldn't say best, right? Not the best essays, but the best example I have of somebody who is too personal is a student who wrote about being pregnant with her first child, and her boyfriend at the time wasn't happy about it, and he tried to purposefully crash their car while she was in the passenger seat to potentially cause harm to her, and hopefully, he was hoping she would lose the baby. And reading this statement, I became so concerned for her and her safety, and it was this terrifying story. I completely forgot that she was applying to medical school. So it's possible to be way too personal. And you also don't want to do things like give your personal medical history or your family medical history, right? Being too professional, the best example I have of that would be a student who wrote about how much she enjoyed dissecting the brains of mice. And while I understand she was trying to demonstrate how much she enjoys research and scientific inquiry, it came across as very creepy. Like my first reaction after reading it was, ooh, creepy, creepy, creepy. So you don't want to be too personal because you'll distract people from the purpose of your essay, and you don't want to be too professional or robotic, right, because it will be very easy for the person to reject you and not give you second consideration. So what are some ways to approach this task successfully? So for those of you listening, what are some ways that you plan to approach your personal statement?
You plan to approach your, okay, outline, says Patricia. Outline first, says Darren. Writing out my work and experiences first, says Rachel. Have people look over my drafts, suggests Stephanie. Answer why medicine rather. Writing down multiple ideas and narrow down from there, says Jocelyn. Right. And here's, let's see, a couple more. Tying in professional roles to a personal anecdote. Discuss the different reasons that I've chosen the medical field and how my previous history has been involved in the decision. Nick, write out all my experiences and choose one that stood out to me more than less will condense later. That's Saba. Amanda says, how do you know when your personal statement is finalized, done with editing? That's a good question. I'm going to leave that for later.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Look back at why I wanted to go into medicine and create a list of experiences to provide a background for why I wanted to become a doctor. Tell my life story, says Patrick. I'm not sure that's such a good approach, and I'm sure you'll deal with that, Alicia. Tell a story not included in the CV. And then Matthew says, expressing both weaknesses and strengths and how they have grown from my weaknesses. Okay.
These are excellent.
Yeah.
So I agree with the person's comment about outlines, right? You wouldn't build a house without a blueprint, right? Like that house wouldn't turn out very great, right, if you tried to build one without a blueprint. So the same applies, right, to essays. If you create outlines and structure your essays and make critical decisions about what goes where and why, and that gives you a chance to think about themes and how are you going to continue the thread of those themes throughout the essay, you're going to end up with a much better final product. Editing is a critical part. So giving yourself enough time to write multiple drafts and to give yourself a break in between those drafts, right? So you need distance, right, to be able to look for errors and to be able to see what you need to change, right? You need to give yourself time off in between drafts. Life story, that's such an interesting approach. That depends, right, on what your life story is, of course. But sometimes telling a story in chronological order isn't the best way. Sometimes telling a story out of order can be much more compelling and much more exciting. Right, there's a Latin phrase called en media res, in which you start a story in the middle, and it creates a dramatic effect. Right, so that's one possible way to approach it and to bring people's attention to perhaps an event or an experience you had that would explain maybe the beginning of why medicine, right, or could launch into multiple reasons why. So there's so many different ways to approach it, but a life story depends on your life story. That might work, or there might be a better way to do it. But you want to be strategic about using an outline, right, so that you can identify which approach is best for you given your life story. I love the question that somebody asked about how do I know when my personal statement's finalized. So I really think working with someone like me or my colleagues, professional editors, can be very helpful. It's hard, even with my own writing, I seek advice. Because it's very hard to see for yourself when something's ready and polished. So it's always good to have another person review your work before you submit. Okay, so we're going to talk about now personal statements as being authentic, honest depictions of your real motivations. I've found, in my experience, having students come up with a list of reasons, and I think, didn't somebody mention, Linda, that they come up with a list?
Yeah.
Coming up with a list. What's that?
Yes. Yes, you're right.
Yes, somebody did say that. So coming up with a list is a good place to start. If you don't know where to start with the personal statement, making a list of all the different events or reasons or any impact that medicine had on your own life, right, can help you identify, okay, what should I focus on here, what is unique, and then you can prioritize, right? You can decide, okay, this reason is more important to me than this reason, and that's when you can start your outline. But it takes 10 good ideas to get to one really great idea. And I think students are often surprised by how much effort is required to generate really good ideas. But one thing I tell people is you want to throw spaghetti at the wall, because what happens when you throw spaghetti at the wall? Eventually something sticks, right? I'm sure as like a kid, right, you guys must have done that. But eventually, if you throw enough spaghetti at the wall, something will stick. And so it takes a lot of strands of spaghetti, a lot of different ideas to get to one really fantastic idea. So be willing and ready, right, to do some self-exploration, self-reflection, to really deeply think about all the different reasons why you're considering this career path. So your own personal statement can be a masterpiece, right, a culmination of your experiences and emotional maturation, right, like the Mona Lisa. And that's my goal for every client that I work with, that their personal statement so beautifully reflects their personality, that they're proud and excited to submit it because they know that it's going to help them get secondaries and interviews. So we're going to move on to the activities section, and we'll return to questions at the very end if you have questions about the personal statement that I didn't cover. So for the activities section, don't reinvent the wheel, right? Start with your resume or CV. And if you're not updating your resume or CV regularly, and if there's only one thing you take away from this webinar, I hope it's that you will start updating your resume and CV, right? As soon as you get an award, as soon as you take on a new position, update your resume or CV. It's too easy to forget all the stuff that you're doing or that you've done. And when it comes time to sit down and write your activities out in your application, it's too easy to forget stuff. So make it a habit of updating your resume or CV every time you get a new award or every time you take on a new activity. You'll think future you will think past you. So it's worth taking the time to do it. So it is a time-consuming task to fill out the activity section. You have 15 activity descriptions to complete. So break it down into sections, right? So complete 5 activity descriptions per day. So set a goal for yourself so you slowly but effectively increase your stamina in preparation for secondary applications. Because I had a client actually this week who didn't realize how many essays he was going to have to write for secondary applications. So you can imagine his panic when he discovered that each school has an average of 3 to 5 questions or essay questions. So just slowly but steadily, right, increase your stamina. So do you guys have any questions about what activities to include or not include in this section, for those of you listening.
Right. Any questions about the activity section? We do have some other questions, but they're not related to the activity section, so we'll
Okay.
save them, okay? Rodolfo asks, are there things not worth including?
So the question is, what are things not worth including?
Yes.
Oh, it's an interesting phraseology.
Yeah.
Things not worth including. Okay, the weirdest and funniest things I've probably ever seen, somebody put down blood donations. And then someone put that they donated their hair for cancer. That falls into the blood donation kind of category. What other things? Things that you got course credit for. So today a student tried to list a master's thesis. So if you're getting course credits for an activity or for an experience, then it's like double dipping to include it in your activity section.
Double accounting. Double accounting.
Yeah. Like college credit for it. That's like not fair. So don't do that. Somebody had a really good question about, do I include my special master's degree program as an activity or my post-bac program? That's a really great question because that depends on the program. If the program included weekly meetings, events, team building activities that you did not get course credit for, see a pattern there? Then you can include it as an activity. So if it required a lot of time outside of school and there were a lot of events involved, of course, then you could include it as an activity. Okay. But no double dip.
Got it. All right, we actually have some very good questions here. If we don't get them to the now, we do have Q&A at the very end of the webinar, so hopefully we'll come back to some of these because they're really, really good. What if you don't have 15 activities to list?
You've got to have 15 activities to list. So in that case, you could add a section, awards and honors. You could add a hobbies section. You've got to use all 15. Like, it will actually hurt your application if you don't use all 15, because you're going to be competing with students who have way more than 15. They're combining multiple activities to fit everything they've done into 15. So it will absolutely hurt your application if you have less than 15 activities.
What should a good activity description include? This is Amanda's question.
So the way that you will write about your activities in the activities section versus the personal statement, for example, I think one of my pet peeves is when people try to list everything they've done in the personal statement, because you're basically just duplicating the activity section if you list everything you've done in your personal statement. So an activity description is going to have, describe what the organization or event was. So you've got to tell them who, what, where, when, why, right? And then describe what your responsibilities were. So describe what you did as part of that activity. And you want to go into detail to cover all aspects of your contributions. But yeah, so you want to very, very clearly lay out what was the purpose of the organization event and what was your level of involvement and what were your responsibilities. And in the personal statement, you would not include anything like that about the activity. It would be a very different perspective of that experience.
Okay. Let's move
Preferably
on.
Not a list.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's move on and maybe come back to some of these questions later, all right?
Sure. So now we're going to talk about the distribution of types of activities, so categories of activities. So on the next slide, you'll see a pie chart, and you'll see that it includes leadership, volunteer work, clinical experience, as well as personal talents and hobbies. And I always have students ask, why would I include a talent or a hobby? And I would say, because it shows that you have balance in your life and that you have outlets, for when you're under a lot of stress, that you have multiple outlets that you can go to so that you don't blow a fuse, right? So it shows that you're a balanced individual and that you have a healthy ways of coping with stress. So in your activity section, right, if you have all clinical experiences or all volunteer work, right, there could be, right, you want to demonstrate a commitment to multiple different areas of your self-development. You don't want to devote yourself too far in one direction. Although that being said, I mean, you really can never have too much volunteer work, right? But you also have to, if you need to support yourself, right, paid employment, right? And that looks great to have things like paid employment because it shows self-responsibility, maturity, right, that you have professional work experience. So having a wide variety of activities in that section is only going to help you. And long-term activities as well. So for those of you listening, can you give me examples of each of these that you will include in your application?
In the question window, please. What would you include as a volunteer activity, as a leadership activity, as a clinical, as a talent or hobby? Let's see, we're getting some responses. Caregiving, says Savannah. Vice president of club, I assume that's going to be the leadership one. Cancer fighter, a little bit more specificity, please. Clinical, scribing, excellent. Teaching, leadership, form of leadership. Hobbies, ballet or travel. Leadership, captain of a competitive gaming team. I'm reading off different examples now. Clinical experience, shadowing. I know you're going to have something to say about that. EMT, says Sachin, that would be, I assume, a clinical example. Clinical work in ER for 2+ years. That's Mark. 500 plus hours of research, emergency room volunteer, leadership, says Patrick. Hospice volunteer, says, I'm gonna mess up your name, Matanrayo. I apologize for mispronouncing anybody's name. Medical assistant, clinical. If I worked in an organization for 3 years, but I had various roles as I got promoted each year, are they 3 different experiences or one huge experience? That's a good question. Maybe I'll save that for a little later, okay? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah.
Clinical.
All of these sound fantastic. I didn't get any red flags from any of these. Sometimes we do.
Okay.
And these all sound really, really good. Yeah, these all sound fantastic. And keep in mind, right, leadership doesn't just include like a vice president or president title, right? Leadership can include things like tutoring or mentoring. So activities you might not think should be labeled as leadership actually can be and should be. So if you held a manager position, right, in a paid employment role, right, it would probably be better to list it as leadership instead of paid employment, especially if you don't have that many leadership or if you have 0 leadership activities. So you want to be really smart and strategic about how you list each activity, right, so that you make sure that you've got a little bit of everything, but it's especially important to have leadership, volunteer work, and clinical experience. And it's always good to have talents or hobbies like intramural sports, right, or music, or any kind of drawing or artistic talent. So you definitely want to cover all those areas. So for those of you listening, if you were, sorry about that, if you were evaluating applications at a medical school, what would you look for?
In the question window, please. What would you look for in applicants? They're right. They're typing. They'll catch up in a minute. Well-rounded applicant, long-term commitment to activities, well-rounded, ability to balance life, I assume work, variety of interests and dedication to healthcare, responsible, diversity in what experiences they've had, involvement in the community, the check, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, variety and passion, the check in the application in terms of the application fee, long-term commitment, variety, how they describe their experiences, robust experiences, commitment to providing patient care. Saba says he'd look for shadowing. Awantika says she'd look for somebody who's friendly. Compassionate, says Rodolfo, which I think is key. Intelligence, empathy, long-term commitment, ability to speak with others, says Nick.
These sound really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so compassion, definitely empathy. But there was recently a study actually about how compassion is actually a better trait for healthcare providers, because empathy, if care providers truly actually practiced empathy, it would be exhausting, right? It wouldn't be possible to sustain that level of interactions with every single patient, especially if you're seeing people for 15 minutes at a time. So compassion for sure. Empathy is sort of out, but compassion's in. Yeah, and then definitely patient care, long-term commitment, absolutely. It's a red flag, right? If somebody has 6 months or less at every single activity that they've done, that's a major red flag. That could mean that that person's very difficult to work with. It could mean that there's some instability there. So it could be either financial instability where they're having to move frequently, or it could be, just, personality differences or just difficulty working with them. So long-term activities are especially important to have. And what's considered long-term, a lot of people ask. So at least a year or more. So a year or longer is considered long-term. Shadowing's good to have, but keep in mind that shadowing is considered the most passive form of clinical experience. So the only person who really benefits from shadowing is the student, right? The doctor doesn't benefit, the patient doesn't benefit. It's more the student. So it's not viewed as highly. It's very passive. Also, what's the best letter of rec you could get from a shadowing experience? Like, oh, she was as quiet as a fly on the wall, right? Like, what could somebody possibly say, about observing you, observing them, right? Shadowing. So just keep in mind, right, that you want to look for more active forms of patient care. So some people had mentioned earlier medical scribe. That's a fantastic one. Medical assistant. EMT is a really good one. So you want to, or CNA is a fantastic one. So you want to go find, right, either volunteer or even paid positions in which you get hands-on clinical experience, right, active hands-on experience. Yeah, but these sound really, really great. So from an evaluator perspective, so I want you to imagine, so if you receive 5,000 applications and you have 100 spots, right, you're going to be very careful about who you choose to send secondaries to, and then even more careful about who you interview, right, for those 100 coveted spots. So it's helpful, I think, as you're filling out your applications, it's helpful to take a moment to step outside your own perspective and think about, okay, if I had to be the person reading this application, what weaknesses, what strengths would I identify? And if you're having difficulty seeing that within your own application, ask for someone else to review it with you, or, work with someone like me, with accepted.com. So working with a professional editor and consultant who can give you that kind of distance to see, okay, what do I need to improve in this application, or what is strong about it? All right, so moving on. So we're going to talk about the most meaningful essays. So for those of you listening, what is the difference between the activity descriptions and these essays?
Anybody want to? Impact, says Darren. Impact on you or on others? Instead of just describing what you did, you tell how it impacted you, says Spandana, and others, says Spandana. Darren says on you. So there's one thing that can be clarified. Describing the transformative nature of the experience, says Patrick. Good. More space to elaborate, says Jocelyn. More characters to discuss the impact of the activity. Impact on your decision to go into medicine, says Mark. Personal statement focuses on meaning, how the activity was transformational for you, says Carl. Want to continue?
Yeah, these sound good.
Yeah.
So you want to explain why it was meaningful for yourself, But also, I mean, a good conclusion for these essays is going to include why it was meaningful to you, of course, but then what impact did you have on the community you assisted, right? So the best essays for the most meaningful essays are going to address why it was meaningful to you, but also the bigger impact of your work. So on a person-to-person, individual level, or possibly a community-wide level, depending on what you were doing. Yeah, so that's an important thing to consider when you're writing the conclusions for these essays. So the character limit is different. It's 700 characters for the descriptions and 1,325 characters for the most meaningful essays. And the total number required is also different. So there's 15 activity descriptions versus 3 most meaningful essays. So to come up with more material, some people, I think, feel overwhelmed by the activity section. But again, this is a chance to say, like, hey, right, make sure that you're increasing your writing stamina for the secondaries, because this is nothing compared to how many essays you're going to have to complete for the secondaries. So if you're feeling fatigued, and I have some clients feeling that way, feeling fatigued by the activity descriptions and the most meaningful essays, brace yourself, right? Okay, so brainstorming, so taking some time to journal. If you are starting this process early, if I have any freshmen, sophomores, even juniors listening, the best advice I can possibly give you is to keep a journal as you're doing these activities, especially, right, if you're going on medical missions to other countries, or if you're working at a free clinic locally. Write down your ideas, experiences. Of course, use fake names if you're writing down any anecdotes or vignettes from your patient interactions for privacy reasons. But journal, write about your experiences, and you're going to want to kiss future you will want to kiss past you for taking the time to do that, because I can't tell you how useful that information is, because we forget, right? We forget details. So taking the time to reflect, so really thinking deeply, right, about why those experiences were so meaningful. And that's part of what I do, and what I love to do with my clients is getting them to answer questions and to reflect and to consider things that they never considered before. And I think really it's unique to the medical school application process that you get to spend so much time thinking and reflecting on why you're entering this career path. So this can be a very exciting time to really get to know yourself better and to become more articulate in expressing, right, these experiences and your feelings about these experiences, but also to get to know yourself better and to make decisions about, if something was so meaningful to you, could those potentially turn into future career goals? And are those areas that you want to pursue as specialties in the future? So this can be a very helpful time and will perhaps help you identify the direction of your career. So many people ask, how different are the activities descriptions discussed in these most meaningful essays compared to the personal statement? So that's a really excellent question, because it does sound like it would be confusing. So the way that you write about your experiences in the activities section through the descriptions and the most meaningful activities, right, should be very different than how you cover any of that in the personal statement. So number one, right, you're not, ideally, right, ideally, you're not going to list everything you've done in your personal statement, because then it's how is it any different from the activity section? So you really should be focusing on 1 or 2, maximum 3 activities in your personal statement. And then the way that you cover them, right, will be from a very different angle than what your responsibilities were, why it was so meaningful, right? There shouldn't be any cutting and pasting from section to section. It should all be original work in every essay on the primary. So are there any other ways to come up with more ideas for the most meaningful essays? So for those of you listening, what are other ways that you plan to come up with ideas for these essays?
In the question window, please. Anybody have any ideas? Use ideas that maybe were scrapped from the personal statement idea. In other words, your B list, huh, Blake? Darren is asking you to elaborate a little bit. Nick,
elaborate means?
I think on your question.
Okay. So what are ways you guys are going to generate content for the most meaningful essays? How will you approach?
Letting them know how it changed your life. That would definitely be something that's part of the most meaningful essay. And then Nick says something that changed your way of thinking or expectations. So I guess that's a criteria he'll use. And several people are actually saying very similar things.
Yeah, I really like that phrase, letting them know how it changed your life. That's really, yeah, that's a really wonderful approach to it. And then I think another, sorry, go ahead.
There's a really good question here. I'm gonna mark it for when we get to the question section. I found, Linda says, I found that listening to podcasts help, other stories and similar experiences that bring up another point I may have missed. We, by the way, have a podcast, so check out Admission Straight Talk. Find a story of growth, says Darren, which I think is a great idea. Describe maybe how you felt witnessing a particular experience, I guess somebody else's experience. Brainstorming with family on past activities. This is Jonathan's suggestion. I think it's a good one. Do you want to move on?
Yeah, these are really good. So brainstorming with family, yeah, reconnecting maybe if there are friends that you did the activity with. Chatting with them might jog your memory. Going through old photos, right, from the event or from the experience. Right. I really, really liked the idea of using stories of growth. That's often, right, a wonderful way to demonstrate how much you love learning and your potential for growth. So that's a very, very good approach to use. There's research on creativity that in lying down actually helps you come up with ideas. Like, who knew, right? So maybe planning time. What's that?
I thought it was exercise. I sometimes come up with my best ideas when exercising.
No, that's interesting. I'm sure probably increasing oxygen to the brain or getting the heart pumping probably helps. But apparently, according to research, lying down helps people come up with new ideas. So maybe scheduling a nap.
Well, somebody else is taking a shower. He always gets his best ideas in the shower.
Oh, yeah, I think that's true, too, actually. And you explore. This is a great time to figure out, how can I make this process go more smoothly for myself? Try showers, right? You can get a dry erase waterproof. Right?
It's kind of hard to take your computer in the shower. That could be a little bit expensive.
Yeah, that might be a bit much. Yeah, try lying down to come up with ideas. You can try dream incubation. Ask for a dream about a topic or to remember something that you've forgotten that you once knew. That's a whole interesting subject. So there's many, many wonderful ways to come up with more ideas for these essays. So try as many as you can. Try as many of these different approaches because I promise you it will help when it comes to your secondary essays. So we're going to move on to the statement of disadvantage. So you may ask, what does it mean to be disadvantaged? So there are 3 different types of disadvantage. There's social, economic, and educational disadvantage. And I'm going to give you examples of all 3. Social disadvantage would be if you grew up in a single-parent household or if you were treated differently due to ethnicity, language, religion, sexuality. Economic disadvantage would be if you relied on food stamps, if you lived in Section 8 housing, if you received any kind of public assistance programs from the government. And they think the federal poverty limit for this year is like 26,000. So if your family's on or below that number anytime when you were growing up, you can apply as disadvantaged, especially if you received public assistance funds or support programs. Educational disadvantage would be if you have a learning disability or if you attended low-performing public schools that couldn't provide resources, basic resources, or educational opportunities like AP classes, things like that that are pretty much considered standard in most schools. So will anyone be completing this section? If you could give us a show of hands.
Let's see what we have here in terms of hands. About 17%, 16, 17, 18%. 18%.
Okay, Okay, great, cool. Very cool. So if you're writing the statement of disadvantage, the most effective way to approach this essay would be to simply state the facts, right? So you don't want to exaggerate anything or make it sound like exaggeration. No, no need to make it sound like you're giving excuses. Or some people, can be a little whiny, right, in this section for being honest. And while, I'm sorry that you had those experiences, just state the facts. If your family relied on food stamps for a certain number of years, state the facts of it. Also, you want to be careful with tone, right? You don't want any bitterness to come out, don't surprise yourself with sarcasm, right? I recently had a student doing that. He didn't even realize that he was being sarcastic in these essays. You don't want to surprise yourself here. And no replication. So you don't want to cut and paste anything from this essay, from the personal statement and vice versa. So it should all be original writing in each essay. So somebody asked a really great question, I think it was last time, when not to apply as disadvantaged. I think that was a question we got in the blog, actually, Linda. When should a person not apply as disadvantaged? And pretty much, my experience, if you're applying as disadvantaged for one reason, like if you have a learning disability and that's the only reason why you're applying, but your family was, otherwise, well off in all other areas, like that would be a reason not to apply as disadvantaged. If your family had the resources to support you in getting, testing and additional time on exams and accommodations in your classes and on all of your exams. The AAMC prefers to use the socioeconomic forms of disadvantage, and I think it's because it's easier to verify. So, right, they can use your FAFSAs to look at annual income for all the years that you were that you filed a FAFSA. So that's a really reliable, easy way to look at someone's tax returns, right? If they're willing to share them, to identify if someone is socioeconomically disadvantaged. So AMCAS does prefer applicants who are who can demonstrate through family income or federal assistance programs, or by being in a a federally designated medically underserved area. They prefer to see proof, right, evidence that you meet socioeconomic disadvantage. Okay, so any questions about applying as disadvantaged? So for those of you listening.
Yeah, we have one here. Candace asks, is being first-generation college student considered a disadvantage?
Can you repeat that?
Is being a first-generation college student considered a disadvantage?
That's not enough. By itself, it wouldn't be enough.
Right, that's what I thought. Can I write my personal story, but in a positive way, what my family faced?
Yes, and I do recommend that. Yeah. Stating the facts, but having, right, ending on a high note in the conclusion of that essay, right? What did you learn from that struggle, or how did that experience of struggling, make you a better person, or more dedicated to your goals in serving the community.
What if you belong to the three categories? Should you talk about all three?
Yeah, so if you have experienced all three forms of disadvantage, right, it is best to describe how you meet each of those forms.
All right. Mark asks, do disadvantaged students have a higher chance of getting accepted?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is.
Chance of acceptance. Well, so I think the best explanation I could give would be some medical schools, like UC Davis School of Medicine and several California medical schools I worked closely with, they actually had a separate committee for evaluating applicants who were disadvantaged. Like UCLA had a completely separate committee for those applications. So on many campuses, if you apply as a disadvantaged applicant, and the key is, and if it's appropriate for you to have applied as disadvantaged, then you'll be considered, usually, like you'll be reviewed by, your application will be reviewed by a person instead of put through the general screening. So there might be an advantage in terms of a human being will look at your application before it's rejected if you apply as disadvantaged. But basically it comes down to, in most schools they're evaluated by separate committees. And I mean, if you are truly disadvantaged, it's only going to help you to apply as a disadvantaged applicant because you have had to overcome more obstacles than other groups. But if you apply as disadvantaged and you're not truly disadvantaged, that is dangerous. That's a very dangerous area. I had a student once apply as disadvantaged because her parents got a divorce, I think when she was in college, and it was emotionally distressing, which of course that would be
True.
But that's not enough of a reason to apply as a disadvantaged applicant. So it's really interesting. Like some people will have really inappropriate reasons for applying as disadvantaged like that, like a divorce and no other form of disadvantage. And then other people will be so severely disadvantaged that they don't even realize that they should apply as disadvantaged because they haven't compared their situation to anyone else. So if you're unsure, it's a good idea to, do your homework and ask your parents, hey, were we ever on food stamps? Did we ever live in Section 8 housing? Did we get any kind of, healthy baby program because we were below, we were considered below the poverty limit or income? So you want to do, talk to your parents, collect the information, and make the decision based on, can you prove that you were disadvantaged?
Grace asks, what if you had federal assistance at some point in your life, but now your family is well off?
Yeah, so you can apply as disadvantaged if you experienced any of these three forms at any time in your life. So yes, if you were on public assistance for 5 years and your family recovered and they're doing better now, yes, you can definitely apply as disadvantaged.
Okay, so the last one on this one. If you receive the FAP waiver, is that proof of being disadvantaged?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good question because the fee assistance program, they basically run out of funds. So if the sooner you apply, the more likely you are to receive the FAP. The FAP by itself, if you receive it, I would say is not enough. Because I think their limits of what they consider appropriate for giving fee assistance to are much higher than like the federal poverty limit, where it's like 26,000, or below is considered, being on the poverty level. So in my experience, they give it, to first come, first served. So they give it to the most disadvantaged students comparative to who applies for it. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure it does. I didn't quite follow the whole thing.
So if you're applying for FAP and you're being compared to whoever applies for FAP, that might be a much higher threshold than it would be for things like being eligible for food stamps or Section 8 housing.
I see.
See what I mean?
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, they're giving out the FAP based on first come, first serve. So it's the need, who looks the neediest.
Right.
But whoever's the neediest applying to that program, which
Okay.
it will be very different for who's eligible for food stamps.
All right. I think I got it now. I think we should
Okay.
move on.
Okay, let's go on. So we're going to talk about the coursework now section. So how long, for those of you who have already applied before, are reapplicants, how long did it take you to complete the coursework section of the application last time you applied?
In the question window, please. Forever, says Mark. And Darren. 3
We're
days.
still doing it?
3 days, says Andrew. A few hours, says Savannah. 10 minutes, says Alexander. I guess he's a quick worker. Tiffany says at least an hour. Not too long once you sit down and get through it, says Maria. Hours and hours, says Carl. So there seems to be a certain dichotomy here. Way too long, very repetitive, says Emily. Okay, go ahead.
The whole reason why I asked this question is because for those of you who haven't yet started it, I just want to alert you to the fact that it does take, quote, forever, right? Hours and hours. So do give yourself enough time to do a good job on this section. You want to make sure, right, that you correctly classify every single class. And it takes time because you have to list every single class. So pacing will be critical. So doing a little every day, reviewing sections, right, you've completed before adding new material. And that way you can double check, right? Did you make any mistakes? Is everything correct? So check for accuracy, as you complete each section of the coursework. So what kinds of issues, so for those of you who worked on this part of the application already, what kinds of issues did you come across?
The course classification was the hard part, says Jonathan. Sarah says categorizing classes, adding current classes, gathering old transcripts, says Darren. None. This one guy had no problems. It was easy for him. All right, Darren says from dual enrollment. Emily says different classification of classes that I had expected sometimes. Apparently the classifications were the easiest. The hardest, rather. Study abroad, says Tiffany. Summer classes, said Patrick. Listing AP credit, says Sachin.
Yeah. So classifying courses, right, is the most complicated part of listing your coursework. So how do you determine whether classes are considered BCPM, whether they calculate into your science GPA? Because BCPM stands for biology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics. And what you'll need to do if you're not sure, right, you'll need to review the course descriptions. When in doubt, you could always ask your school advisor. They'll be familiar with the courses and the course codes, especially with pre-health advisors. And when all else fails, you could always contact the AAMC, or me or my colleagues at Accepted, right? We are very familiar with these kinds of questions and can help as well if you choose to work with us. So give yourself, right, enough time to review, make sure everything's correct. It's terrible when a student realizes that, oh, something that should have been part of their BCPM wasn't listed as part of their BCM, so their science GPA is actually appearing lower than it should be, right? You don't want to put yourself in that position. So take your time just to do a good job with this and make sure it's correct, because you want an accurate science GPA. So we're going to talk about school selection now. So I recommend applying to 20 to 25 schools. So I think that's a very safe range. Right, if applicable, right, you can apply for the Fee Assistance Program, the FAP as somebody mentioned, offered by the AAMC. They give you a reduced fee on the MCAT exam, so you can get sometimes half the cost of the MCAT, I think is what it is. And you get to apply to 15 schools for free. The application fee is completely waived. And the secondary fees are also waived. So apply for the FAP, right? It's crazy not to if you feel that you might be eligible. When selecting schools, evaluate your stats, right? Compare these to medical schools you would like to attend. So I tell students, right, you want to choose the schools as your safety schools in which both your GPA and your MCAT scores fit within their range. right? If only one of your numbers fits within the school's ranges, if, say, like just your GPA fits in the school range, you would consider that school a reach. So, or if it's just your MCAT that fits their range, but your GPA is just out of range. So those schools would be reach schools. So you want to really evaluate your stats and be realistic about which medical schools you would be competitive at. Attending pre-med conferences to network with other students, and medical school outreach officers is very helpful. And really, future you would be so thrilled with past you if you take the time to visit medical school campuses, like now, especially if you're applying this cycle. You'll have more to write about the schools in your secondary essays, and it'll help you decide if you can see yourself on that campus. So go and visit at least all the medical schools in your state. Right? You have the greatest chance of acceptance at the schools in which you're considered a resident of the state. So it would be kind of crazy not to visit the medical schools in your state, especially if they're like an hour or two away. It would be weird to get a secondary from a student and they've never been to the campus living that close. And research schools that specialize in your research interests or fields of interest. So we're going to go into the basic information section. So this section of the application is so easy that, yes, it could be considered a piece of cake. And we'll have a beautiful image of a chocolate cake on our slides. So if you're not hungry yet, you will be when you see this cake. That being said, most people don't double check and can make really silly mistakes. I think probably the most horrific story I have for this would be the student who called freaking out because he'd listed the wrong birthplace. And it wasn't just the wrong state, he listed the wrong country. Right? And it's a nightmare to get the AAMC to make any changes to an application that's been submitted. Let me tell you, it's a complete nightmare. So take your time and double check all personal and basic information before submitting the application. So the thing I want you to keep in mind is slow and steady wins the race. I think a lot of people are panicking right now. The application's now open. And the sense I'm getting from my students is, you know, panic with a capital P. I get it. I know it feels like, right, it's now or never. But really, slow and steady wins the race. So take your time, do a good job, right? So this is my favorite part of the webinar. So for those of you listening, what are some of the most embarrassing or worst mistakes that you have made when rushing during an application process?
Anybody want to admit it in the question window? Grammar errors, says Tiffany. Could be spelling mistakes, says Awantika. Anybody else want to share? I once had a client write that he wanted to exorcise his brain through research as opposed to exercise.
Oh no!
Yeah, no, that's real. I mean, I caught it, so it didn't go out, but not filling in all coursework, says Mark. I happened to be drinking something at the time I got to that. That was kind of messy. I sent an old CV to all of my letter writers and didn't realize until a week later. Well, hopefully, you know, you're able to fix that one. All right, and then
yeah, the AAMC is really, I mean, it's such a big organization that when you do have to have something changed or you try to contact them to change something, oh, it's such a nightmare. It's just not worth it. Like, just do it right the first time.
Yeah.
And then they try to scare you, right, by asking for your AMCAS ID and your name. So just avoid, right, the stress. And double check your work. Look at it multiple times before you submit it. The most common mistakes that I've seen are when students list only one form of contact information, only an email or a phone number, one phone number, and then I try to call them or reach them for an interview, to schedule an interview, and you can't reach them. right? Like you don't want to ever be in that situation. Not completing all sections of the application, sloppy essays that don't represent the applicant, right? That happens when you're rushing. Not including contact information for work experience or activities listed. That's a red flag. When somebody doesn't list any contacts for any of their activities, definitely suspicious. So list somebody, even if it's a classmate, to verify that you did the thing, whatever it was. List somebody. Somebody's better than nobody. Letters of rec arriving late, right? That can lead to someone getting a rejection. And just so you know, and some people will hopefully breathe a sigh of relief, I have like one piece of good news. The letters of rec are due with the secondary applications, not the primary application. So that's why we're not covering them in this presentation. Okay, so was there a collective sigh of relief, hopefully? Timeline. So applying early is critical. It's a rolling admissions process, so first come, first served. So if you put together, I mean, don't be too slow, right? Don't go too slow with your application, because if you submit a gorgeous, beautiful, perfect application in the last week of August, chances are someone may never even read it, right? So you want to submit June, July, August becomes late. And the first medical school deadline is October 1st, so you don't want to go anywhere submitting as late as that, because they just may not even get to your application if they've offered all their interview spots by the time they get to your application. So errors with the AAMC application, 3 cycles. The system crashed. Like they had an unprecedented number of applicants, and it was a nightmare. The students who applied, do you remember the date, Linda? I felt like it was in like mid to late July. Wasn't it like
Something
towards the
like
end of
that.
July?
It was something like that. It was also several years ago at this point.
Yeah, so the students who submitted after that date, their secondaries, their interviews were put months behind schedule. It was crazy. So you want to get your applications in June, July. Right? Medical schools can run out of spots for interviews and acceptances. So how many people found this presentation useful? If you could give us a show of hands.
Whoa. Whoa, you have a lot of very happy people here.
Yay!
Yeah, overwhelming. Whoa, thank you. Okay, we're going to get to Q&A in just a minute. Thanks, Alicia, for the excellent presentation and all the great advice. The overwhelming majority of you have found Alicia's presentation helpful, and it is. But we're going to go into the Q&A in a few minutes, and many of you are going to have questions that are going to reflect, and many of you already have had questions, they're going to reflect limitations of webinars and articles and podcasts and downloads, because all these resources, no matter how hard we try to make them as good as they can possibly be, all of them are general advice and principles. They are the what's of admissions. And let's face it, it's hard to get accepted to medical school. Applying the excellent advice Alicia provided today to your situation, your qualifications, your goals, and your experiences, that's the how of applying. And that how, that process, begs for individual advising from experienced professionals who can guide you through the Ironman marathon that med school admissions is. And that individual advising, as you'll see in a moment, is a key factor not only in applying successfully, but also in applying confidently. And that's your goal now, to apply it successfully and confidently. Given the complexity of the application process and the odds, as you can see from the screen, you need a guide who knows the process inside and out and who can support you through this grueling journey, as he or she has supported many, many, many others over the last 20 years. You need Accepted to be your guide. With Accepted, you get a customized approach that fits your needs. You get a consultant that will work with you. You will not be shunted around to other consultants. You'll work consistently with this individual. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We try and tailor our advising to your needs. It's definitely not. I know some consultancies have an approach, and no matter what the client needs, that's what they do. That's not accepted. You'll get options, so if you only need a little bit of help with one element of the application, that's what you get. If you are starting from scratch with your primary application and you want comprehensive assistance, what you can get. We have hourly options where you pay just for the time that you've used, or we have packages where you pay for a particular basket of services. You would receive, again, as I mentioned, one dedicated advisor who already is a medical school admissions expert, but who becomes expert in your story and helping you present it. Our staff, like Alicia is a former post-bac program director, as I mentioned at the beginning. We have other former post-bac program directors. We have an admissions director, former admissions director. We have highly experienced consultants, people who've worked in post-bac programs. And that's the staff. But when this one person works with you one-on-one, that person is your mentor, your guide, and provides candor and objectivity combined with decades of experience in medical school admissions and a supportive approach to the process. We have the experts, the guides, who can mentor you through this process so that you achieve your goal of applying confidently and successfully. Former admissions directors, staff members, post-bac program directors who have been on the other side of the process and who can be your guide as you go through it. Here's what I suggest you do. Visit www.accepted.com/primary. Choose the service that's right for you. Get the guidance you need for that missing how that I discussed a few minutes ago. Go from confusion to clarity, from doubts to confidence. Now, some of you may say or will say, isn't accepted expensive? Well, so is rejection. Our fees are clear, but the cost of rejection is not quite as obvious, even though it can be significantly higher. So let's take a look at the risks of not applying with Accepted. Could mean you have to reapply, and that can be a few $1,000s, especially if you include interview costs. A year of earnings at a much lower level than after you earn your MD or DO degree. Potential that you could have gotten into a better program with greater lifetime opportunities and even earnings. Now, every year we work with applicants who talked to us a year earlier and decided after taking the do-it-yourself approach and getting rejected to work with us this time around. They would have been better off working with us initially, and so would you. But enough from me. What do accepted clients say? Well, here's some feedback. I'm not going to read everything on the screen, but I will read a few highlights. Hi, Mrs. Nimonkar. I do apologize for lag in my response. It's evidence that I am busy because I am a med student. I was offered 4 interviews total and was accepted to 2 schools. I chose to attend UCF College of Medicine in Orlando. I'm eternally grateful to you and all the critical advice and help you gave me. I could not have made it without your help. Another one for Alicia. My experience working with Alicia was amazing. She was knowledgeable and guided me through all the steps of the process. Alicia's input from my essays was invaluable. The interview prep was important because it opened my eyes to the types of questions that could be asked and really prepared me to respond to those questions. I would highly recommend using Alicia for the application process. Now, Alicia is a wonderful, skilled, and talented consultant, but there's only one of her, and she does book up. I don't want you to think that we don't have other talented experts on the staff, so here's a little more feedback. Dr. Newman, that's over here on the right. This is absolutely impressive. I cannot be happier today. The tone of my text sounds personal, professional, consequential, and so true. Your work is spectacular. Or this one for Dr. Gordon. Dr. Gordon was wonderful to talk to. This was sent to me. He was very honest, but in a way that was constructive. He pointed out the weak points in my application and kindly explained the best way to present them, which was my biggest concern. Or this one for Jessica Pishko. Jessica really helped me with writing my personal statement. With her help, I was able to better prepare myself for my secondary applications and later interviews. Now I will be starting medical school in the fall. We'd love to help you as we helped the authors of these comments you just saw and thousands of others over the last 20 years. So once again, this is what I recommend you do as a follow-up to today's webinar after the Q&A. Visit www.accepted.com/primary, choose the service that's right for you, get the guidance you need, and then apply confidently and effectively. Now let's take some of your questions, okay? And there are a lot here. We've run over, and most of you have very patiently stayed. Let me get the questions organized. Hold on a sec. Okay. For reapplicants, is it looked down upon to reuse a most meaningful experience and, wait a second, and its description on the new application?
Could you repeat that again?
Sure. For reapplicants, is it looked down upon to reuse a most meaningful experience and its description on the new application?
Yeah, that's not a good idea. So if you are reapplicants, you want to change as much as humanly possible from your previous application. It's going to be one click for those schools to pull up your previous application to compare at the schools that you previously applied to. So it's absolutely necessary that you change, especially your essays, but hopefully have new activities, as well as addressing any other weaknesses in your application.
Okay. Fareha asks, what if you have more than 15 activities? How do you know which are the best ones to include? It's a good question.
Yeah, that's something that I discuss with my clients is I'll have them give me a complete list of everything that they've done college and after, because unless you continued an application or you continued an activity that you started in high school, in college, right, you shouldn't include anything from high school, right, unless it's something that you continue to do during college and after. So that would be my advice.
Okay. Rodolfo had a really good question, and let me find it again. Give me a sec. Okay, should I prioritize the strongest experiences in the essay section versus the activity section?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Should I prioritize the strongest experiences in the essay section versus the activity section? Maybe I guess where should he put his most impressive experiences?
It depends, right? So I definitely recommend you get letters of recommendation from the best experiences, and those activities or experiences that you highlight in the personal statement, as well as in the most meaningful essays, you should definitely have letters of rec for those.
Okay, great. Hold on a second. This thing moves. Do the medical schools take into account the difficulty of the courses? This is Matthew's question.
I would say, it varies from campus to campus. So medical schools are going to look at, where you took your coursework, but they're also going to understand that there's grade inflation on some campuses versus others. And that's why they rely on the MCAT, right? It gives them a standardized exam that everyone takes, through which they can compare students. So yeah, they take that into account by also comparing MCAT scores for students.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mark asked, what if during a semester you experienced a significant decline in GPA due to having surgery during that semester? Where would it be appropriate to explain that, if anywhere?
So if it had an impact on your grades, right, you could explain that in the personal statement, right? You want to address any weaknesses, up front, or you will definitely have secondary questions from some schools asking, is there anything else you want us to know? And that would be an appropriate topic to cover there.
Okay. This is kind of a hard one, I think, to answer across the board, but how much self-reflection should be included in the activities if it's not, well, actually this one I don't think is so difficult, if it's not your most meaningful experience?
So the activities, you've only got 700 characters.
Yeah.
So that comes out roughly, maximum 10 sentences or less. So you don't have much space to really go too deep.
Right. So you don't have too much room, and I don't think it's even really expected there. What if you don't really have any hobbies? I'm not really artistic, says Jessica.
Well, hobbies, right, it doesn't have to be something artistic.
Exactly.
Right? Hobbies can be a lot of different things. A hobby could be a sport. Hobby could be music. It could be a lot of different things. So it doesn't have to necessarily be something artistic. It could be cooking, right? It could be a lot of different things.
And the activities don't only have to be hobbies. It can be things that you enjoy doing. Creative, I'm not artistic at all, but I definitely have hobbies and interests. Okay, let's see. Linda asks, most medical schools have GPAs of average GPAs of 3.6 and higher. How does someone with a GPA below that start deciding what schools to apply to and not?
So if you have a GPA below a 3.6, how do you decide on schools?
Yeah.
Again, it's looking at, those ranges of the GPAs that schools accept and comparing your numbers to their numbers, so MCAS as well as GPA. So, right, you want to make sure you fit well within the ranges of the schools that you apply to. Does that answer it?
I think so, yeah. And I think you can't just look at the GPA in a vacuum. If your GPA is really low, I'm pretty sure that Alicia would recommend a post-bac program where you can acquire better study skills and also just get some good grades that will show that you can handle the work that medical school demands. That's absolutely foundational for any kind of successful medical school application. Now, keep in mind also that averages are averages because people are accepted with GPAs that are below average. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an average. It would be a threshold. So, keep that in mind too. But it's really hard for Alicia or me or anybody to say, oh, your GPA is X, therefore you're in or you're out. You have to look at the whole picture and also how far below that GPA is.
I mean, also somebody could have a 4.0 GPA and, have some serious red flags in their personal statement.
Yeah.
So even though somebody has competitive numbers, right, they could very easily make a huge mistake somewhere else in the application.
Okay. Sachin asks, should you use similar intriguing, flowery prose used in the personal statement and the activities section to demonstrate your qualities and show what you learned grew from the activity?
I would ask you to consider what you would prefer if you were evaluating applications. If you were comparing, one applicant who used very flowery, descriptive language versus someone who stated the facts, who would you be most interested to train as a doctor, to choose to study with you? Would you prefer someone who speaks or uses flowery language or someone who simply states the facts?
Right. I'd go back. I don't remember. I think your assumption is something that both Alicia and I are calling into question. Why should you use flowery, ornate language in the personal statement? Somebody in the very beginning, I don't remember who it was, said that one of the difficulties of writing a personal statement is writing something that's profound but simple. And I said what you really want is something that's profound but clear. So flowery language usually obfuscates. And therefore I would...
Yeah, it goes back to the idea of being a reliable narrator. Right. So The Great Gatsby is considered such a great work of fiction because it has a reliable narrator, right? You've got Nick, right, who's narrating is the average Joe that anyone can relate to, narrating, right, The Great Gatsby's, Gatsby's parties and how he's larger than life and his lavish lifestyle. And because there's a reliable narrator, right, you begin to see Great Gatsby through, right, this character's eyes. You understand how very lavish he is. So you want to establish yourself as a reliable narrator. The opposite would be, something like Robert Browning's poem, My Fair Duchess. By the end of the poem, you realize that the narrator has murdered his wife.
Oh, gosh.
And it's disturbing, right? As you're reading this gorgeous, beautiful poem, and you're like, wow, this language, and then you realize that this man is describing how he murdered his last duchess. And it's horrifying once you come to the realization that the narrator is not reliable, that the person is in fact insane, right? So it comes down to, using language that that your audience would appreciate. And your audience for this piece of writing are doctors, admissions professionals, healthcare providers, researchers, right, people who work for the medical school. So, right, you've got to take into consideration, right, these people love facts, data, numbers, outcomes.
Clarity.
So you want to, yeah, clarity. You want to write for your audience.
And they're also looking at you as a future physician who's going to be talking to people of all socioeconomic and educational backgrounds. And let's face it, compliance is a major issue in clinical medicine, and the ability to be clear, direct, kind is absolutely mandatory. Flowery language is not going to help convince any of your patients to follow your advice or your instructions, especially if they don't understand them. So I would stay away from flowery language or unnecessarily flowery language throughout your application. That would be my suggestion. Okay, I think we're going to take one more question. Let's see. Nick asks, should we always try to use the complete character limit, or is less okay?
That depends. You know, if you can say what you need to say in less space, that's always preferable, because you don't want to add fluff, right? You don't want to have any unnecessary information. So my advice is if you can tell your story in less characters, that's fine. I wouldn't use like half the characters. That's dangerous. But they're not going to use a character count. They're not going to look at, oh, this person used 5 characters less than the limits. Ouch, you know, like off with their heads. They're not going to do that. Right? They're going to look to see, you know, did they use as much of the space as they needed to convey their story and to tell it in a compelling way.
Okay. I want to, Alicia, thank you again. You've been tremendously generous with your time and your experience and your insights. Applicants, thank you very much for your time, your answers, your questions, and your participation. I'd like to share a couple of my thoughts before we part. Remember the advice Alicia has given you about authenticity and timeliness, balance and steady effort, and so much more. And we will be posting the recording, so if you didn't hear all of it, you can go back and review. Now, a final story from me and a final thought, I think in reverse order. If you're worried about your below average stats, if you're concerned about the personal statement, other writing required to apply successfully, not to mention the interviews, if you're anxious about spending the next year immersed in this process or so stressed about this marathon that you are undertaking, remember the excellent advice that Alicia has given you today and your goal. The advice was slow and steady wins the race. And the goal for today, and for this year really, this process is apply it successfully and confidently. Here's feedback from a client who worked with Accepted. I've been thinking about this whole crazy process after being accepted to 3 medical schools, and I know that I wouldn't have had a prayer if it weren't for your substantial help. They say the essays are one of the most important aspects of the application, especially for someone like me whose numbers are a little below average. So I can't express my appreciation to you enough. You have helped me immeasurably. You greatly distressed an important part of this process that was making me quite anxious. I felt much more confident in my essays after working with you. End of quote. Slightly low numbers, concern about the quality and quantity of writing you'll have to do between the personal statement, the most meaningful experiences, and the secondaries. If you can relate, then also realize this client did it. He got accepted to medical school, and so can you.